Hey everybody, welcome back. So last week we looked at the evolution of life throughout the Paleozoic era. We talked a little bit about the Precambrian and the Paleozoic, and that really brings us to the Mesozoic. But what I want to do to introduce the Mesozoic is really talk about how organisms are a little bit different in the later part of the Paleozoic and especially in the Mesozoic into today. So the lecture for this week is what I'm calling From Fins to Fangs. We're really looking at how we go from fish to terrestrial animals, and then really look at how dinosaurs are such an important group of those early terrestrial organisms, especially in the Mesozoic. So really, the overall arch this week is looking at the evolution of tetrapods, amniotes, and dinosaurs. So let's jump right in. So what exactly is a tetrapod? Well, you and I and your cat and dog and horse and pet bird are tetrapods. A tetrapod is any vertebrate animal, so an animal with a backbone, which lives on land or which had an ancestor that lived on land. So while whales and dolphins and walruses and so on are predominantly aquatic, they are derived from a terrestrial or land-dwelling ancestor. So tetrapods include the groups Amphibia, Reptilia, Aves or birds, and Mammalia. So all of your frogs and toads and salamanders, snakes, lizards, crocodiles, and turtles, birds, and all mammals, including humans, are tetrapods. So here's an evolutionary tree showing chordata, which is anything with a notochord or a flexible kind of rod in their back. This would include lamprey. But vertebrata would be any kind of organism that has a vertebrae, so actual series of vertebrae making up their spine. So this would include other fish, and it would include all tetrapods. And you can see if we look from tetrapoda, and we look up that tree, we have amphibians, we have synapsida, which is mammals and their relatives, diapsida, which is reptiles and birds, and that includes all of tetrapods. So generally speaking, tetrapods have four walking legs. So the word tetrapod or tetrapoda, tetra meaning four, and pod or poda is Latin for foot or limb. So a tetrapod has four limbs. Count them yourself. You have four limbs, two arms and two legs. Well, what about snakes and whales and legless amphibians known as sessalians? These are considered tetrapods because when we look at the fossil record, their ancestors had legs. So snakes actually had legs. In fact, some large constricting snakes still have remnants of these inside their bodies. Whales, for example, still have a pelvis inside their body. It's not connected to anything, but it's left over from when their ancestors had walking legs. So tetrapods are predominantly terrestrial animals with four limbs, though later generations may have lost those limbs or may have returned to the water. Over the last century or so, paleontologists have actually been able to reconstruct a fairly detailed family tree of how the fish to tetrapod transition actually took place. And most of this was happening back in the middle to late Paleozoic in the Devonian period into the Mississippian and Pennsylvanian. But really the Devonian is when a lot of this is happening. So if you look at the bottom of this evolutionary tree, we have a true fish. And then as we work up that ladder, we get to our first true tetrapod. So let's take a peek at each one of these briefly. And there's a couple of characteristics we're going to trace as we do so. First of all, we're going to be looking at what's going on at the back of the head. You'll notice down at the bottom, our lowest member on the tree here is Eusthenopteron. It has no neck. And if you look at the skull diagram immediately to the left, you'll see the purplish blue area. This is something that a lot of fish have today. It's called an operculum. The operculum is a bony plate that fits on the side of the skull and kind of covers that region from the head to the body. Also, we're going to pay attention to where the eyes are. Notice on fish, the eyes are on the sides of the head, and it's mostly a round-shaped head. But as we work up this ladder, we're going to see the operculum going away. We're going to see the advent of a neck, and we're going to see the head flattening dorsoventrally and eyes kind of being migrated up towards the top, more like a frog. So let's take a look at these five organisms briefly, just to kind of trace some of the changes going on from fish to tetrapods in the Devonian to kind of learn where tetrapods come from. So here's Eusthenopteron. This is a fish. Eusthenopteron is one of those rhipidistan lobe-finned fish that we talked about last week. They have fins, but the fins have a series of more robust bones in them, not like your modern day goldfish or bass that have ray fins that make up the bones, and the fins have long, thin ray-like bones. Eusthenopteron is a lobe-finned fish, so it actually has these larger, robust bones, and they're not limbs yet, but these are the bones and the parts from which limbs evolve. So these are the parts that are being modified through generations. So we start with Eusthenopteron, which is truly a fish. It is a fish in all practical ways. It's just got some weird types of fins. So we're going to move up the ladder now to our next organism. This was about 385 million years ago, where we see Panderichthys. So Panderichthys, again, is a fish. However, it's a fish whose limbs are starting to develop the characteristics of what we would call limbs. So especially in the back of Panderichthys, its hind fins are essentially a pelvis, a femur, a tibia, and a fibula, and then smaller rays that branch out into the actual fins themselves. The structures are there where we're looking at very rudimentary forms of limbs, but they're still predominantly functioning as fins. Again, we move up the ladder to a very important specimen about 382 million years ago, Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik rosea is when things start to really change, going from fish to tetrapods. In fact, if you want a so-called missing link, which inside note, paleontologists hate that term because it kind of misrepresents how evolution works, but we'll play with it anyway. If you want a missing link between fish and amphibians, this is about as close as you're going to find. Because in this organism, we see characteristics of both. In this case, the front fins are true limbs. We have a humerus, a radius, and ulna. We actually have wrist bones in Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik also has lost its operculum. You can look at the skeletal images on the right and see this fish has a neck. It truly has a neck. It also has wide bowing ribs and a very strong shoulder blade. All of these are really important characteristics when you're starting to venture outside of the water. The importance of a neck, think about it. When you turn your head, that's all neck. Now imagine you're walking down the street and you're going to turn a corner. You don't do the Frankenstein's monster, turn your entire body at once. You usually turn your head first and then move your body afterwards. So your neck is very important for helping mobility. It helps you move around and keep an eye on your surroundings. The importance of a wrist and a shoulder blade are, you can see in the illustration of Tiktaalik here, it almost looks like it's doing push-ups out of the water. It was probably snapping at insects that were close to the water's surface. So it needed to be able to move around, and that shoulder blade is going to act as a big muscle attachment, and the wrist is going to help it be able to move those fin-like hands around, or its wrist bit, into being able to have increased mobility. So it has a true neck for increased mobility. It does have tetrapod-like limbs in the front. However, its back limbs are truly fins still. So it's tetrapod in the front, very fish in the back. And the bowing ribs are important because if you look at modern day fish, their ribs are very, very straight. And that's why if you look at, if you catch a bass or even look at a goldfish in a tank, they're really kind of flat, top to bottom, or what we call laterally flattened. And that's because they are just breathing through gills. But if you're looking at a terrestrial organism, something that's breathing air, you need those bowed out rib cages. Our rib cage is kind of barrel shaped, and that's to allow for lung expansion when we're breathing in and out. So Tiktaalik had these ribs, suggesting it may have been doing a little bit of breathing air, not necessarily using gills. So while this animal was entirely aquatic, it may have stuck its head out of the water to feed and to breathe as needed. So Tiktaalik is a really, really important fossil that was found in Greenland, and it's a great example of really investigative paleontology. The paleontologist who discovered, the paleontological team that discovered Tiktaalik were looking for something that would be a transition between a fish and an amphibian. So they said, well, when would this be happening? Well, based on the fossils we have, we would expect it in Devonian-aged rocks. Okay, well, what kind of environment would we expect this in? Well, we would expect it in a terrestrial to marginal facies, so where there'd be shallow waters. Well, where do we have Devonian rocks that represent shallow water coastal facies? Oh, Greenland. And they spent a few summers in Greenland, and this is what they found. So if you know the geology, if you know the facies, and you know geologic time, and you know your fossils, you can make some predictions about where you are more likely to find very important fossils. And this is an example of how one played out very successfully. So now we're going to continue moving up the ladder to about 365 million years ago and look at our first true tetrapod, Acanthostega. So Acanthostega, also late Devonian from Greenland, but it's a little bit younger than Tiktaalik. It is one of the first true amphibians. However, it still probably spent its entire time of life in the water, similar to how seals and walruses do today. They can move on land, but most of the time they spend all their time in the water. So the head is flattened dorsoventrally with the eyes on top, and that's great for poking your eyes just above the water while the rest of your body is underwater. They had a long tail with big spines coming off of it, not for defense or protection, but actually to help them swim, so their tails were paddle-like. They have true limbs in the front, back. They have lungs. They don't have the operculum. This is a true tetrapod, a true amphibian. And then we move up to one of the more important and really well known and well studied tetrapods from that time, Ichthyostega, about 362 million years ago. Ichthyostega lived at the same time as Acanthostega, but we actually think that Ichthyostega was walking around on land a little bit more, probably had more of a similar lifestyle to seals where, again, spending a lot of time in the water, but they can be on land. If you look at the limbs on Ichthyostega, they're pretty massive. Notice that huge strap-like shoulder blade that's sticking up on the skeletal diagrams of Ichthyostega. This suggests that it's walking on land. The bigger the shoulder blade on a four-legged animal, that's telling you the amount of weight that they're holding. Now, if you're in the water, you don't need a big shoulder blade because you're buoyant in the water. But if you're on land, you have to deal with gravity in a very different way. So to hoist your body up, you need those strong shoulder blades. So next time you're petting your cat, your dog, feel around on their forelimbs. They've got big shoulder blades, and think about it. They run, they climb, they jump. So I'm not saying Ichthyostega was running and jumping and climbing, but it definitely could hoist itself up and walk on land better than any of its contemporaries for other early tetrapods. So this is the transition from Eusynopteron, a lobe-finned fish, to Ichthyostega over, a few dozen million years. And we start seeing these diversifications more towards a terrestrial lifestyle. Here's a couple of images of some of the fossils of Ichthyostega. Again, very well-developed limbs, and if you count the toes on the feet, they've got 5 toes, just like you. They also had 5 fingers, just like you. Now, being an amphibian, their reproductive cycle is still tied to water. So think frogs and salamanders, right? They give birth to organisms or lay eggs to organisms that hatch, and essentially are very fish-like. And then as they grow up, they become more tetrapod-like. So there's some ontogenetic changes going on with these organisms, just like with modern amphibians. However, as we move forward in time, and we go away from the mucky, swampy conditions of the Devonian, Mississippian, and Pennsylvanian, we start seeing these tetrapods take on characteristics to help them live more land-based, not requiring a reproductive cycle based on water. This is where we start getting reptiles. So a couple of characteristics we notice with our early reptiles versus early amphibians is everything's just a little bit kind of beefed up. They have a more massive shoulder girdle and pelvic girdle, in other words, shoulders and hips. They have more robust limbs and a very stronger, tighter vertebral column. Because amphibians are still spending a lot of their time, especially reproductive time, in the water, they can swim around and they need that really flexible body. Most, not all, but most early reptiles are more terrestrial based. They're laying eggs on land and they're hanging out on land, which means they can't just swim around. While many of them do swim, their life is mostly based on land. So they need these reinforced structures to help them move around on land a little bit easier. And these are characteristics that become very important as we go to the end of the Paleozoic and then move into the Mesozoic and see how dinosaurs and other archosaurs start to take on these characteristics and modify them for their own needs. Now, organisms that walk around on land and lay eggs on land or give live birth on land are called amniotes. Okay, so amniotes are a type of tetrapod. There are still tetrapods, but it's a vertebrate tetrapod whose embryo develops in an amniotic egg. Now, we as mammals are a type of amniote. You might be thinking we don't lay eggs. No, there are a couple mammals that do, like the echidna and the platypus, but we as mammals give live birth. However, there's still those same amniotic characteristics during gestation when you're in your mom's tummy. Okay, the amnion, the chorion, the allantois, those are all there as part of an egg. Now, reptiles and birds lay eggs on land, and that's very different than what frogs and salamanders do, which lay their eggs more like fish do in the water. Amniotes will lay eggs on land or give live birth. So the characteristics are the same, whether you're looking at a mammal, a bird, or a reptile. It's just the way that we handle that egg is a little bit different. So what we're going to do now is kind of branch out that tetrapod family tree a little bit more. We still have amphibians are a type of tetrapod, but now we move up the ladder and there's amniotes. And amniotes have two main branches, our so-called reptiles and the synapsids. Now let's look at reptiles a little bit more. And I have it in quotes for a reason, and that's because reptilia is kind of an odd term. This would include turtles. It includes a group called diapsids, and diapsids include lepidosaurs, and these are snakes and lizards, and archosaurs. Now, archosaurs include crocodiles, dinosaurs, birds, and a couple relatives in between. On the other side of the amniote tree, we have synapsids. Again, like diapsids, this has to do with the structure of the skull, and we'll talk about that in a moment. This includes some of these so-called mammal-like reptiles, though we don't like that term anymore, from the Permian period, and it also includes our modern-day mammals. So we, as mammals, are synapsids, and birds and snakes and crocodiles and lizards are diapsids, and turtles are relatives of diapsids under the kind of reptilia group. And this is a little strange because most of you are probably thinking, I've never thought of a bird as a reptile. But we're going to get into why that is. Now, amniotes, again, lay eggs on land or give live birth, and this characteristic is what separates them from amphibians and the basal or early tetrapods. Okay, so amniotes on up include everything you see there, reptilia, synapsida, diapsida, and all of their branches in between. So, synapsid, diapsid, what does that mean? And we've got a couple others. If you look at the skull of any vertebrate animal, any tetrapod animal, specifically amniotes, you'll notice a couple characteristics. We all have an orbit, right? A place for the eyeball. We all have a nares where our nose hole goes. But at the back of the skull, there's a bunch of small bones that are all kind of fused together. Even your own skull is made up of numerous bones that are fused together. One of the bones that is immediately behind the eyeball is called the postorbital, or PO in our diagram. Behind that, maybe towards the back of your skull, you have the squamosal, which usually connects to the postorbital further behind the back of the skull. Now, let's take a look at our anapsid skull here. Anapsids just have one opening in the back of the skull, and that's for the eye, so one on each side. We have this weird thing called an eriapsid. There's no really living eriapsids today, but they have an extra opening above the squamosal and postorbital behind the eye. This is called a fenestra. Fenestra is Latin for window or opening, and the function of this fenestra is for muscle attachment. So muscles from the back of the jaw would wrap up around the back of the skull and into that fenestra. And this makes an eriapsid bite pretty strong. Now, synapsids have one of these extra fenestrae, but it's on the lower portion of the squamosal and postorbital. And this means that those muscles are a little bit tighter around the base of the jaw to the back of the skull. And then when you look at diapsids, they have both. They have the upper fenestra and the lower fenestra, which means they have two places for muscle attachments. Now let's think back to our previous diagram. Mammals are synapsids, and all of our reptiles are diapsids. This means that you and your pet cat and your pet dog are all synapsids and have that lower extra opening for muscle attachments. Meanwhile, birds, crocodiles, and dinosaurs have the diapsid condition. They have two extra openings at the back of the skull on each side. That gives it a very, very strong muscle attachment. Now let's talk about synapses for just a minute, though. The image here right next to me is Dimetrodon grandis. It's a well-known fossil vertebrate that you might have seen before in kids' books on dinosaurs. It is not a dinosaur. In fact, Dimetrodon is more closely related to you and I than it is to dinosaurs. And we know that based on its skull. So if you look at the skull of Dimetrodon, it only has the one lower temporal opening. So it has a synapsid condition. So this is actually an early mammal-like synapsid. We shouldn't say reptile. But why is that like us? How do we have that? If you feel around here's your cheeks, or my cheeks, right? Feel your cheekbones, and then follow that bony ridge all the way around to your temples. And you can see this on figure B. That is called your zygomatic arch, right? Now, if you put your fingers right against your temples and you move your jaw around, okay, what you'll notice is you can feel the muscle movement from your jaw way up here, but you don't feel it around this bony ridge. And that's because this bony ridge, our zygomatic arch, is that spot where the muscle attachment is underneath. And that's that temporal opening. So we do still have this characteristic. It's just been modified where it's, instead of it being a hole in the side of your head, the hole has formed from the bones branching out to give us this arch. Okay? So that's something that we share with Dimetrodon. So when you bite down really hard, you can feel the muscles from your jaw kind of attached at the side of your skull. Okay? So that's one of the characteristics that tells us that things like Dimetrodon are more closely related to us than dinosaurs. Dinosaurs and crocodiles have the two extra openings, which allow a really strong bite. So I've been bit by a dog, and it wasn't fun, but I'd be bit by a dog again over a crocodile any day. Now, in the late Permian into the Triassic, or beginning of the Mesozoic, we had a very specialized group of synapsids called the therapsids, or the so-called proto-mammals. So proto meaning an early version, like prototype. These therapsids were probably warm-blooded, though still laid eggs. So very similar in physiology to something like a platypus or an echidna, but some of these were large, very successful predators. And some of them were about kind of badger or medium dog-sized. But the therapsids did make it through that Permo-Triassic extinction, and they are the lineage of our modern-day mammals today. Now, with all of these discussions of family trees, I want to make sure that we all understand the cladistics or phylogenetics that we're going to be using, how we'll be discussing family trees of dinosaurs especially. So let's get a couple of terms under our belt first. When you see a family tree like this is a phylogeny. It's a way of graphing the evolutionary relationships among organisms, and it's not that different from your own family tree if you were into genealogy, tracing back ancestors to another country. A clade is any group of organisms that includes a common ancestor and all of its descendants. So if we were to look at this entire tree with specimen or species A through G, that would be a clade. However, we can also look at group ABC. Notice how they share a common point in the middle. That also would be a type of clade. Group DE would be a clade. Group FG would be a clade. Group DEFG would be a clade. Anything where you can get that group and all of its descendants would be a clade. So this would also be a monophyletic group. Okay, so the whole thing would be mono, one, phyletic, or evolutionary relationship. So one family, one group. Now we have two other types of phylogenetic groups that we need to mention, because when you're studying evolution, especially in the fossil record, you run into these problems sometimes, and these are what we call artificial clades, meaning this isn't really a real thing, and if you see this pop up in your analysis, you know you have a problem. A paraphyletic group would be if you have a clade. Let's say you're studying a group of organisms, but you exclude some of the descendants. So let's say we're studying group B, C, D, E, and F, but we don't want to study A and G. Well, we have to. We have to include those into our analysis because they're part of the clade. This would be kind of like having a family reunion and you don't invite the one cousin you don't like. Okay, you can't do that. That's not part of a true monophyletic study. Similarly, we can't have what we call a polyphyletic group, which is an artificial clade that includes organisms from another clade. So for example, I want to study A, B, C. I'll throw F and G in there too. Well, that's unrelated. They do share a common ancestor, but that'd be like I'm going to study all mammals and I'm going to throw fish in there too. Yeah, well, there's a lot of stuff in between you'd have to include. So what we want to do is always go for monophyletic. We're going to study monophyletic groups. And sometimes in our analyses, we come across something that's paraphyletic and polyphyletic. And we know when we see that, this analysis isn't exactly correct. So these are kind of the ways in which we check our evolutionary studies. So that brings us to the word reptile, which I keep mentioning that in quotes. So what is a reptile? Well, based on my childhood and probably yours, a reptile is any egg-laying tetrapod with scaly skin. And traditionally, this would include crocodiles, snakes, lizards, and turtles, right? However, the word reptile is a little more complicated than that, especially in the common way in which we think of reptiles. Because those Permian mammal-like reptiles, those synapsids, were also scaly egg-laying tetrapods. So we would have to include them, but then we would exclude mammals. So reptilia, if reptilia include mammal-like reptiles from the Permian, all of our, it would have to include modern mammals and dinosaurs, but then exclude birds and other mammals, then the word reptile is paraphyletic. Another way of thinking of it is if you want to exclude birds from reptilia, that is paraphyletic. So the word reptile, either we need to come up with a better word for it, or we need to include birds into it, because evolutionarily and looking at the fossil record, birds are derived from reptiles, and these so-called mammal-like reptiles are not really reptiles. They are mammal-like tetrapods, or mammal-like synapsids. So this is a problem. When you see a family tree, the grayed area here is showing a paraphyletic situation, which means it's incorrect. So instead of using that word reptile, let's use synapsid and diapsid. And hey, we don't have any problems. Mammal-like reptiles, so-called, and mammals are synapsids. Fine. Dinosaurs, birds, and croc, snakes, and lizards, and so on are diapsids. Totally fine. We haven't excluded anything. We're now back to amniota being monophyletic. So diapsids fall into two groups. We have our lepidosaurs, which are our snakes and lizards. And then we have our archosaurs. Archosaurs includes crocodiles, pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and birds. So from the archosaur point up, we have our Triassic archosaurs, crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. And then we can take dinosaurs and branch that open too. So what makes an archosaur an archosaur? Well, these are the two biggest characteristics. One, no teeth on the roof of the mouth or the palate. So if you look at the open mouth of a crocodile or a bird, there are no teeth on the roof of their mouth. This can't be said for all lepidosaurs or other reptiles. Also, their ankle in archosaurs features a characteristic that suggests an upright or semi-upright posture, the way that they hold themselves up based on the ankle, and in some cases wrist, is another characteristic of archosaurs that's not shared by other reptiles like snakes and lizards. Now, since dinosaurs are archosaurs, we really should look at Archosaurian ancestry to really know where we're coming from. And this ankle structure is really, really important in characterizing archosaur and dinosaur evolution and phylogeny. Ankle bones are small and easily preserved. They're very dense. And they can also suggest information about walking and locomotion, whether it's a semi-sprawled posture or an upright posture. Okay? So think about the way that a crocodile walks versus the way that a modern dinosaur, like a bird, walks. And the way they walk is strongly influenced by that ankle. Now, in the Triassic period, which we'll talk more about next week, but we have a number of different archosaurs, and not all of them are dinosaurs. We have the phytosaurs, which look a lot like crocodiles, but they're not. We have the iatosaurs, which kind of look like a cross between a reptile, a pig, and a crocodile, though they're neither. And then we have our earliest dinosaurs, like Coelophysis, which is a true dinosaur. And these all have modifications of that archosaurian ankle, which is, again, one of the characteristics that makes them a true archosaur. Okay, so we have two different types of archosaurian ankle bones. And these correspond to the two different types of postures. So for the characteristics of the semi-sprawled posture, we have what's called a crocodile normal, or CN ankle. And these bones that make up the ankle are called the astragalus and the calcaneum. Now, the crocodile normal ankle, or the CN, has a joint between the astragalus and the calcaneum that permits the twist that you see when crocodiles and alligators walk. They twist their ankles a little bit to the side, and this is because they're not fully sprawled like a lizard, but they're not directly upright like a bird. They're kind of in between. Similarly, the advanced metatarsal ankle is what we see with our birds and dinosaurs, and in which case the astragalus is much larger than the calcaneum. You'll notice in our crocodile and extinct phytosaur examples, they're about the same size. But in basal dinosaurs, the astragalus is huge and the calcaneum's really, really small. So this allows for the ankle to, instead of twisting, it allows it to perform more like a hinge back and forth. And you can see it walking, and notice the way its ankles and its wrists move. When it moves its limbs, that foot twists around to the side. And notice again, it's not fully sprawled out like doing push-ups. There's a little bit of an angle. It's not fully upright, it's not fully sprawled, it's partial. But again, notice the way that the foot works and the wrist works. As it's walking, those twist to the side. There we go. Now we get a better shot of the wrist. I think this is walking through a golf course, which is always amusing. They twist their ankles around, not painfully, as they're walking. Now let's look at cassowaries, a large terrestrial bird, ground bird from Australia and New Zealand. These things can be pretty dangerous, but notice the way that their ankles move. It's more like a hinge without that twist. True dinosaurian walking. So what is it exactly that makes a dinosaur and not something else? These are the 5 main characteristics that all dinosaurs share. First, the shoulder joint faces backwards. So if we think about ourselves, our arm attaches to our shoulder kind of right here in the front. If you feel like your shoulder where your arm attaches, it's more in the front of the shoulder blade. On dinosaurs, it's actually towards the back. Another characteristic is the upper hip bone, the ilium, this large plate-shaped bone that is just above where the thigh bone attaches, is really expanded. So they have a really wide expanded ilium. Another characteristic is if you look inside that ilium, where there's the 2 ilia, one for the left, one for the right, you'll see that there are 3 or more hip vertebrae, or what we call sacral vertebrae. Okay, so the neck vertebrae are called the cervical, the dorsal vertebrae are in the back, the tail vertebrae are called caudals, but the important one here are the sacral vertebrae, the sacrum, the hip. There are 3 or more. Another characteristic is on the hands. There are 3 or fewer phalanges, or finger bones, in the 4th digit of the hand, or it's lost entirely. So this Allosaurus, for example, has 3 fingers, and it's lost that 4th digit, its 4th finger. But some of the more primitive dinosaurs do have a 4th finger, and it has 3 or fewer bones that make up that finger. And finally, the thigh bone itself, the femur, attaches to the hip socket in an open form. So in other words, the distal neck and ball socket, think of the way your thigh bone attaches to your hip, fits into an open hip socket, or the acetabulum. So if you were to remove the thigh bones from this dinosaur, you'd be able to see all the way through its hip to the other side. Okay, so it's a perforated acetabulum. So that neck and ball offset, the shaft of the femur, fits into that open hip socket. So these are the 5 main characteristics that make a dinosaur a dinosaur. If it doesn't have one of these, if it has 4 of the 5, we would call it a dinosauromorph. If it has fewer than those, it's just not a dinosaur. But a dinosauromorph would be saying it's close but not quite. But all of your favorite dinosaurs, Allosaurus, Velociraptor, T-Rex, Triceratops, Brontosaurus, whatever, and birds, all have these characteristics. So here we can see a few of those characteristics in a little bit more detail. This is the pelvis, or the sacral vertebrae, of a Camarasaurus, a large, long-necked plant-eating dinosaur. And you can see it has 5 vertebrae making up its pelvis. And then there's a human sacrum for comparison. So these are quite large. They're about the size of a semi-truck engine, just their pelvis. But again, those are the 5 vertebrae that make it up. So they have to have 3 or more. Here we can see on a theropod dinosaur called an abelosaurid, something we'll get into later in the semester, the arms look like they're attached at the back. Okay, that little kind of slightly L-shaped curved bone in between these 2 big shoulder blades, that's actually its wishbone. And notice these tiny little arms that stick in the back of the shoulder blades. And on the diagram to the right, you can see the kind of forelimb anatomy, again, of a large sauropod, long-necked dinosaur, and you can see that the humerus attaches to the back of the scapula and coracoid bones. So again, that back-facing articular region for the forelimb is another characteristic. And then finally, our others. You can see again that the ball end of the femur there in the lower right, where it would attach into the hip, is kind of offset from the rest of the shaft, and that's so it can fit into that open acetabulum. In figures A and B, you're looking at an ilium of a dinosaur, and you can see how long this bone is, this big plate-shaped bone that's part of the hip. And finally, on the left, that reduced 4th digit, and in some cases, it's just lost entirely. So again, the 5 characteristics of a dinosaur are the backward-facing forelimb, articular joint at least, the elongated or widened ilium, the offset ball socket from the femur of the thigh where it fits into that perforated acetabulum, the 3 or more vertebrae in the hips, and the reduced 4th digit or it's lost entirely. So if we look at our textbook at figure 4.11, we'll find a simplified phylogeny of dinosaurs. And I want to mention this is the classic classification for dinosaurs. There is a new one that's being proposed, and we'll talk more about that in a little while, but we'll just start with the basic one first. So if you look at the very bottom of this tree, we have dinosaurs. Everything above this, in this direction or this direction, is a dinosaur. Okay. We have two main groups of dinosaurs, and that would be the Saurischians and the Ornithischians. So everything on this side of the tree is Saurischian, and everything on this side of the tree in either direction is Ornithischian. So let's start with the Ornithischians. We have a couple of main groups of those two. We have the Thyreophorans and the Marginocephalians. Your Thyreophorans include the spike-tailed stegosaurs and ankylosaurs, so the big armored dinosaurs. Marginocephalians include the horned ceratopsians and the dome-headed pachycephalosaurs. And then we have this other group called the ornithopods, and these are your plant-eating duckbills. Okay, so pretty much as far as we know, all Ornithischians were herbivorous, because we have some very, very primitive ones too from the mostly Jurassic. On the Saurischian side, we have two main groups. First is the sauropodomorphs. This includes the big long-necked sauropods and their slightly more primitive relatives, the prosauropods. And then the theropods. These are all the meat-eating dinosaurs, including modern-day birds. And this is the group that birds would branch off of. Okay. So why do we base this structure? What's Ornithischian and Saurischian? This is entirely based on the hips of these groups of dinosaurs. So the lizard-hipped dinosaurs are the Saurischians. The bird-hipped dinosaurs are the Ornithischians, and this gets very confusing. And if you want to refer back to this, it's in figure 412 in your textbook. We have three bones that make up the hips of a dinosaur. You have the ilium, which we've already talked about. That's that big plate-shaped bone at the top. We have the pubis, which usually is in the front, and the ischium, which is in the back. The hole that those three combine, they make a hole in the middle. That's the hip socket for the femur. That's that open acetabulum that we mentioned. On a Saurischian dinosaur, the pubis and ischium are at an angle apart from each other. On an Ornithischian dinosaur, they are parallel towards the back. Okay, so Saurischians, your theropods and sauropods, are lizard-hipped. Your Ornithischian are the Thyreophorans, the Marginocephalians, and the ornithopods, plant eaters. Those are the bird-hipped. Now, here's where it gets confusing. The bird-hipped dinosaurs are not the ones that are closely related to birds. Theropods are actually the ones that we see are related to birds, okay? And that's a lizard-hipped dinosaur. So it's the opposite of what you would expect. You would expect that the bird-hipped dinosaurs evolved into birds. In fact, it's the lizard-hipped, one group of lizard-hipped dinosaurs evolved into birds. So it's confusing. Just remember that it's the opposite of what you would expect. So these are our two main groups, Saurischians and Ornithischians. So when we talk about Saurischian dinosaurs, we're talking about birds, theropods, and sauropods. When we talk about Ornithischian dinosaurs, we're talking about Thyreophorans, Marginocephalians, and ornithopods. Now, all of our Ornithischians do share some very distinctive features, so we do have good evidence that we do have a monophyletic group with Ornithischians. A lot of Ornithischians have a toothless predentary, meaning that while they do have a lot of teeth, and I mean a lot of teeth in their mouth for grinding lots of plants, the frontmost bones of the skull don't have any teeth. It's more like a beak. So think of Triceratops, the horned dinosaur. It's got like almost a parrot-like beak on it. Now, if you go further back in the mouth, there's lots and lots of teeth. The same is true for this hadrosaur, this duck-billed hadrosaur. The predentary is toothless, though the very front part of the skull is toothless. They also have the Ornithischian pelvis with the ischium and the pubis facing backwards. And then they also have a lot of ossified tendons. So the tendons that we see in the tail and the spine of them, see these kind of cross-hatched that looks like rods of a suspension bridge. That's essentially what they are. So it's kind of neat to go out into the field, into some of the Cretaceous outcrops, and you'll find these fossilized bits of bone that look like pencils. In fact, what those are ossified tendons. Ossification means it's gone to bone. It's turned into bone. So if cartilage ossifies, it turns to bone. In this case, the tendons of these animals to help hold up their big tails have actually ossified. So this is just a number of the characteristics that they all share. So we do have good evidence of monophyly within our Ornithischians. So just to kind of recap and kind of revisualize our simplified phylogeny of Dinosauria. You have Dinosauria, and that branches into two groups, Ornithischians and Saurischians. The Ornithischians have three main groups, Thyreophorans, Marginocephalians, and Ornithopods. Saurischians have two main groups, Theropods and Sauropods. Now, Ornithopods include the big duck-billed, so-called duck-billed dinosaurs. Okay, four-legged plant-eating animals. They walk on either two or four legs, depending on what they felt like. Many of them have some really interesting cranial ornamentation, possibly for communication, which we'll talk about later. This also includes groups like the Marginocephalians, so the horned dinosaurs like Triceratops and all of their relatives. And it also includes the dome-headed pachycephalosaurs, which we'll talk about as well. For the Thyreophorans, this includes our plate-backed, spike-tailed stegosaurs from the Jurassic period, as well as their cousins in the Cretaceous, the large-bodied ankylosaurs. Now, what you see here is actually a sauropod. So this is a sauropod dinosaur. This is Brachiosaurus. So all of our sauropods are the big long-necked dinosaurs, the big massive ones. Some of these pushing the boundaries for how big an animal on land could be. They're fascinating animals, and they're absolutely humongous. This group of Saurischians is cousins to theropods. The theropods include a wide variety of meat-eating dinosaurs, and I've only shown three groups here, but there's many, many more, and we're going to cover them. This does include the massive tyrannosaurs, which are the biggest predatory animals ever to walk the earth. It also includes the kind of infamous dromaeosaurids. These include Velociraptor, Utahraptor, Deinonychus, Dromaeosaurus, the ones from Jurassic Park and Jurassic World. We'll talk more about those as well, but I bring up dromaeosaurids because they are the closest relatives of our modern-day birds. So aves is the group that includes modern-day birds. So, for example, this is a parrot, if in a skeletal view. When you look at things in skeletal view, sometimes they look very, very different than what we would expect. So, a very simplified phylogeny of dinosaurs, and we're going to be going into all of these groups and more throughout the semester. Now, so far, we've talked about dinosaurs being theropods, sauropods, ornithischian, saurischian, and they're pretty easy to classify based on the hips. But we do have a couple of weirdos that throw us a curveball, and one of these Jurassic curveballs is Chilesaurus. We're not really sure if it's a theropod, if it's a very early sauropod, or if it's not even a saurischian at all, if it's an ornithischian, because it has characteristics that all of them share. And it's from the Upper Jurassic. If it was from the Triassic period, that would be a little more understandable, because in the Triassic is when dinosaurs are starting out, and we would expect to have some very, very primitive characteristics that are shared by all dinosaurs. But the fact that we have one in the Upper Jurassic that kind of does everything, we're not really sure where to classify Chileosaurus, which is one of the things that throws a curveball into our classic dinosaur phylogeny. So we're still trying to work out Chileosaurus. So yeah, thanks for nothing, little guy. And while we've been talking a lot about phylogenetics and we haven't really been saying much about the Linnaean classification system, this is the more or less current way that we would classify dinosaurs under the Linnaean system. We're all kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, subphylum Vertebrata, and that's where we differ from dinosaurs past that, because we are in a different class. They're in class Reptilia, subclass Diapsida. Remember, the two extra holes in the back on each side of the skull. Infraclass Archosauromorpha. And then we have our different subgroups. We have the Saurischian and Ornithischian. So all of these are going to be, this is where, notice Dinosauria itself is not even on here because it's somewhere in Archosauromorpha. Saurischians, we have two orders, theropods and the sauropods. And of the suborders of Sauropodomorpha, we have Prosauropoda and Sauropoda. Under our superorder Ornithischia, we have 5 orders, Ankylosauria, Stegosauria, which we would group together into Thyreophorans. We have Ceratopsia and Pachycephalosauria, which we would group into Marginocephalia, and then Ornithopod. As you can see, this gets messy, which is why we're not really going to use it much. So don't worry about committing this to memory. it will not be required. But it is important to note when we get different groups appearing. In the Middle Triassic, in the beginning of essentially the Mesozoic era, is when our dinosaurs first appear. And they're very primitive and they're very poorly understood. In the late Triassic, we get our first definitive Saurischians. And those branch through into the sauropodomorphs and the theropods into the late Triassic. And this is also when we get our ornithischians. But notice, we don't get ornithischians until the very late Triassic. Ornithischians, for being such a very successful group, are really, really strange. And their origins are not 100% understood. And then the thyreophorans first appear, the ankylosaurs, the armored dinosaurs, first appear in the early Jurassic. And then they diversify from there. So this diversification throughout the Triassic into the early Jurassic is a very important part of dinosaur evolution, because the groups that we think of today get their start back in the middle and late Triassic. And unfortunately, we don't have phenomenal records of all of these groups. So this is an area that's being studied very heavily by dinosaur paleontologists today. Understanding dinosaur origins helps us understand their classification and their relationships to each other much better, and helps us get a better idea of the lineages that then follow into the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods and beyond, even including the groups of living dinosaurs today, the birds. And next week, we are going to focus exclusively on the dawn of the Mesozoic, and we're going to look into the Triassic period, how dinosaurs got their start, what kind of world they were inhabiting, and what kind of lineages they were going to leave. So we'll see you next time.